This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
This episode is brought to you by McAfee.
Swimsuit, passport, phone, with VPN activated.
VPN?
Cell phone service is going to be spotty on vacation, so we'll be using public Wi-Fi.
Sounds sketchy.
Exactly. The networks can leave your personal info, like credit card numbers, exposed to hackers.
McAfee's secure VPN lets you browse and bank safely from wherever, whenever. Learn more at McAfee.com/online protection.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Before we begin today's show, I wanted to share some exciting news with you. Ben Franklin's World now has its own Amazon Alexa skill, which means you can now listen to Ben Franklin's World around your house while you cook, clean, or get ready for your day. To enable the Ben Franklin's World skill, just tell your Amazon smart speaker, Alexa, enable Ben Franklin's World.
Okay, here's Ben Franklin's World. Welcome.
And from there, you can command Ben Franklin's World to play a specific episode. Like, Alexa, tell Ben Franklin's World to play episode 130.
Here's 130 Paul Revere's Ride Through History, Doing History Rev.
Support for Ben Franklin's World and the Doing History to the Revolution series comes from the Omaha. Or you can have Alexa stop playing the episode. Alexa, stop.
Okay, come back anytime to listen to your podcast. You just have to say, Alexa, resume.
So that you can do something else and then return minutes or hours later when you actually have time to listen to the episode. Alexa, resume Ben Franklin's World.
Here's 130 Paul Revere's Ride Through History, Doing History Rev.
From the public memory so much that...
If you have an Amazon smart speaker, just tell it, Alexa, enable Ben Franklin's World, and off you'll go. And with that, on with the show.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 179 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Have you seen Hamilton the Musical or listened to its soundtrack? If you haven't, you really should, because it's a lot of fun. It has history in all of its songs, and it often evokes ideas about the American Revolution and the early Republic periods, even as it uses rap, hip-hop, and modern language to do it. Now, needless to say, the soundtrack is a favorite in my household. And my favorite songs are those sung by Jonathan Groff, who played King George III. They're pithy, flippant, and they often get right to the heart of some of the problems early Americans faced. In fact, one of my favorite songs is called What Comes Next? In this song, the character of King George III asks, "What comes next? You've been freed. Do you know how hard it is to lead? You're on your own. Awesome. Wow. Do you have a clue what happens now? Oceans rise, empires fall. It's much harder when it's all your call. All alone across the sea. When your people say they hate you, don't come crawling back to me." Now, for me, these lyrics often call to mind the Confederation period. It's a period that historians often neglect, and I'm not 100% sure why they neglect it. It's the period of United States history that took place between 1781 and 1789. And it's a period filled with war, economic depression, infighting between the states, troubles in the West, and domestic insurrection. I mean, in my opinion, it's like a historian's dream because it's got so much going on. It's also the first time in United States history that the fate of the United States hung in the balance. No one knew whether the United States would survive as an independent nation in this period. This is why some historians have called the Confederation period the critical period of United States history. And today, we're going to explore that period by exploring the Articles of Confederation and why its philosophy and structure of government proved incapable of handling the problems it needed to deal with. Now, taking us through the history of the United States' first Constitution is George William Van Cleve, author of We Have Not a Government, the Articles of Confederation and the Road to the Constitution. And as we explore the Articles of Confederation and the Confederation period, George reveals details about the Articles of Confederation and the type of government it established for the new United States, the political and economic climate within the United States between 1783 and 1787, and how the Confederation Congress became stalemated, and the steps early Americans took to get their government up and running again smoothly. But first, just a reminder that our next book giveaway will take place next week, which is the first week of April 2018. I have lots of books to give away, and all you need to do to participate and claim one is look for the post in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. The Facebook group is a private community, and it's free to join. All you need to do is text BFWorld to 33444 and click the link in the email that'll come your way. All right, are you ready to dive into the Articles of Confederation and the chaos of the Confederation era? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Joining us is a research professor in law and history at the Seattle University School of Law. His research interests have been in British and American history, and he's taught classes on the age of Jefferson during his career. He's also published 2 books, A Slaveholders' Union, Slavery, Politics, and the Constitution in the Early American Republic, and, most recently, We Have Not a Government, the Articles of Confederation and the Road to the Constitution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, George William Van Cleve.
Thanks very much. I appreciate your having me.
Today, we're going to explore the Articles of Confederation, which was the first Constitution of the United States. Yet, it's not a constitution we know a lot about. I mean, when I ask people about the first Constitution of the United States, they immediately tell me all about the Constitution of 1787, which was, in fact, the second Constitution. So, George, would you provide us with an overview of the Articles of Confederation and the type of government it created for the early United States?
You're exactly right. The Articles were the first Constitution of the United States, and they were adopted ultimately in 1781 in the middle of the Revolutionary War. They were a radically different kind of constitution than the one that we have today, based on what I would describe as really a very different theory of government. Basically, the way the Articles worked is this. They created a loose affiliation of the original 13 states. The government operated through a one-house Congress in which all 13 states had an equal vote. There was no separate executive. There was no separate judiciary, although sometimes Congress would create a body that had some judicial authority. The Confederation government had very limited powers. They were primarily powers over peace and war. And even to exercise those powers, the Confederation had to operate with a supermajority. That is, 9 out of the 13 states had to agree on all fiscal and military legislation. There was no commerce power except through the exercise of treaties, and with Native Americans, there was no real enforcement power. The Articles could only be changed by unanimous consent. So as you can see, this was a radically different government than the one we have under the 1787 Constitution. The creation of the Articles represented a fear of centralized government power that really, to most people, was exemplified by the British Empire. So this government was really the pinnacle of Republican thought because it assumed that the states would come together in a Congress, have a rational debate, persuade each other of national policy using a supermajority principle, and then go ahead and execute the policy.
It's really curious to me that in your book, We Have Not a Government, that you chose to explore really just the last 4 years of the Articles of Confederation's history and service as a constitution, really the years between 1783 and 1787. Yet, the Articles of Confederation has a history that begins in 1787 and really goes to 1789 when the new Constitution of 1787 went into effect. Would you tell us what about the Articles of Confederation and its history made you want to focus on this particular period of its history?
Well, I really started working on this book because of a really puzzling argument that I ran into between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. In 1783, Alexander Hamilton was a congressman in the Confederation government. He was elected by the New York legislature, And he wanted the Confederation to agree to hold a national reform convention to take a fundamental look at changing the Articles of Confederation. And his main opponent was James Madison. Now, 4 years later, Hamilton and Madison are on the same side on the issues. I couldn't understand why the two of them were in such fundamental disagreement in 1783. And it turned out that Madison was convinced that he could get reforms of the Confederation that he wanted without holding a convention so that he could avoid changes in the Confederation that he didn't want. Obviously, Hamilton didn't see it that way, and he was so disgusted by the fact that Congress refused to consider holding a convention that he quit and went into law practice in New York. So that's where I started, and I very quickly realized that most people agreed with James Madison in 1783. They didn't see a need for any fundamental change in the Confederation. And yet 4 years later, the convention junks the Articles of Confederation and says, no, we need something dramatically different, radically different. We have to start over. And so I thought to myself, what happened in the space of 4 years that changed enough people's minds about the Confederation government that they wanted to start over? And that's really what the book is about. Now, I should say also that the other reason why I think that studying this period is particularly important is that this was a really tumultuous period after the end of the Revolutionary War, when for the very first time, the United States had the ability to control its own destiny.
You've already provided us with a good overview of the Articles of Confederation and the government it created. And before we explore how the Confederation government worked, I think we should really explore the context that the Articles of Confederation operated in. Would you tell us about the United States right after the War for Independence? What kinds of issues did the Confederation Congress and the American people find that they had to deal with in the aftermath of independence?
Great question. One of the things that really impressed me is how much is going on during the period 1783 to 1787. In fact, when I started to do the research for the book, I became kind of concerned about whether or not I could really do justice to everything that was going on during this period. And in fact, there's some important stories that I don't talk about in the book because I had to make some choices. The important things to know are that the United States after the Revolutionary War was not really a nation in the sense that we think of a nation today. People were exhausted by the war. They had spent 8 years having their lives disrupted. Thousands of soldiers had been killed, families destroyed, people's entire livelihoods are gone. And at the end of the war, basically there was a collection of states and regions that had very limited communication, very little in the way of interregional transportation, and conflicting economic and political interests. At the very same time, right after the war, there is the beginning of a severe recession. Some people would actually call it depression. And in fact, a lot of economic historians think this is the worst economic period until the Great Depression of the 1930s. So prices dropped 16% over 5 years. Thousands of people all over the country lost their homes, lost their jobs. American exports, which were an important part of the economy, were severely depressed. And people were fleeing to the western frontier, very often because they were so poor that they had to go someplace where they weren't going to pay any taxes, they could escape their debts, and they could find what amounted to free land. And when they did that, low-level chronic warfare with Native Americans erupted because, of course, the Native Americans did not want them there at all. At this point, the states and the regions, it turns out, in this period have conflicting views about westward expansion, about exports, about post-war military policy, and about Confederation powers. And some people would say there were even conflicts about the basic concept of democracy itself, whether it should represent a kind of a hierarchy, sort of an aristocratic form of government, or whether it should represent a pure majoritarian democracy. So there's a lot going on, and a lot of it is very unpleasant for a bunch of people who are really worn out by a long and very, very costly war.
Yeah, all of that is a really good reminder that the post-revolutionary period was a pretty chaotic time.
I think that's really a fair description. I wouldn't describe it as pure chaos in the sense that the states, many of them had functional governments. They had militias. They had the ability to control what was happening sort of within their small domains. But at the borders, on the frontiers in the West, for example, most of the states are not really in a position to control what's going on there. So if warfare breaks out, say, in the Kentucky district of Virginia, it's not at all clear that anybody can control what's happening out there. And at the very same time, both the Spanish and British empires are trying to find ways to prevent the United States from expanding westward. And there is no way the Confederation government itself is in a position to really cope with that kind of opposition. So chaos is strong, but severe economic recession and a lot of tumult is the way, I think of what's going on here. And the real problem for the period is, what can the state governments and the Confederation government do to try to manage all of these social strains that are occurring?
From the way you described the structure of the Confederation government, the states really had more power than the central government. And I wonder if we could talk about this and the political divisions you mentioned a bit more. Was there a Confederation equivalent to our red state and blue state divisions, that we talk about today?
Let me sort of take that one from the top. You're exactly right that the states had far more power as a practical matter than the Confederation government did itself. And the Confederation government was set up to keep it that way. That's why the states wouldn't give the power of taxation to the Confederation government. So the states wanted to manage a lot of these problems themselves, and they were divided. And they were divided both economically and politically. Economically, the states are divided because many of them rely on exports, and their export economies are completely separate. So, for example, New England sells fish, as an export. The southern states don't sell fish as an export. They sell tobacco as an export. They don't sell fish. So, in effect, what's going to help tobacco exports may not help fish exports, and they don't really care. So there are sharp conflicts of economic interest in terms of trade policy and in terms of how you want to protect the economy. And at the same time, there are important ideological divisions. Many leaders after the Revolutionary War thought the Revolutionary War government, the Confederation, had done a good job of running the war. They couldn't see any reason why it should have more power, and they were very afraid that giving it more power would turn it into a model of Great Britain, turn it into another centralized, tyrannical government that not only taxed people heavily, but created a standing army in order to enforce the tax laws that would reward wealthy people. So that's a group called the Federalists. Typically, historians call them Federalists. And you found them all over the country, but they were especially strong in Virginia. The Lee family, Richard Henry Lee, Arthur Lee, are outstanding examples of federalism. And in Massachusetts, people like Samuel Adams, one of the famous revolutionaries, very much opposed to giving the central government more power. At the same time, there are other leaders like George Washington who believe that the Confederation did a miserable job of running the Revolutionary War. Washington was disgusted by the way Congress had run the Revolutionary War. He thought they had prolonged the war and that their inefficiency, their inability to make decisions, the fact that they tried to micromanage the way the army ran the war were all huge problems. And he wanted to see fundamental changes to strengthen the Confederation government, especially to give it tax powers. So there are these political divisions between the nationalists like Washington and Hamilton on the one hand, the Federalists on the other, and important economic conflicts of interest. So the government by itself going to have trouble reconciling these conflicts of interest in the Confederation structure because it requires supermajorities. 9 out of 13 states have to agree on any fiscal or military legislation. And in the best of circumstances, it's hard to get 9 out of 13 people to agree on anything. And if they have conflicting interests, the way these states and regions did, very often it was impossible to get them to agree on anything but the lowest common denominator solution. So there weren't really political parties in the modern sense, but there certainly were important economic and political conflicts that had to be managed and that the government had to cope with.
You said that the states wouldn't provide the central government with the power to tax the American people directly. And this seems like a really surprising notion to us because when we think about the American government today, many of us think about its taxation power. So if the national government under the Articles of Confederation didn't have the power to tax, how exactly did it raise the money it needed to fund the war for independence, its operations, and, to pay off all the war debts it accrued?
That's a very good question. And I think it gets to the heart of why the theory behind the Articles of Confederation really was a different theory of government. The Confederation, the Articles gave the Confederation the power to make requisitions on the states. And that is, Congress would decide on a budget, and then it would decide, okay, we need $3 million, let's say, for the Army this year. It would parcel that out among the states using a formula that had been established by the Articles of Confederation or by congressional agreement and say, okay, Massachusetts, you owe $200,000. The idea was that Massachusetts would simply send a check to the Confederation in response to the requisition. And the people who set up the Articles believed that that would actually happen. And during the war, very often, it did happen, at least when the war was occurring in the backyard of the states that were getting the requisitions, because they had a very strong incentive to make sure the Army had enough money to protect their part of the country. Once the war is over, the states stop sending in the checks. During the period that the book covers, and really from 1781 or so to 1787, the states only paid 30% of the requisitions that were sent to them by Congress during that period. And some people say, well, they didn't have the money, they couldn't really do that. Other people say, no, actually their priorities were very different. They wanted to pay state debts first, they wanted to pay state employees, they wanted to keep their taxes really low, and so they weren't going to pay their Confederation debts. Whatever the reason turns out to be, they didn't pay. So this theory failed. But it was a theory that people thought would actually work when they created the Articles. And it took years after the war for people to realize we're never going to be able to make this system work.
So the states really avoided paying their taxes to the central government. I mean, did the states not have an internal taxing power so it could tax its people?
Well, that's a good question. And the thing to understand about the states not paying is that no one could figure out a way to make them pay. And so what did they actually do? Well, the states did raise money, and they raised money pretty much the same way they had always raised money. Very often it was through either a property tax of some kind or through a head tax called a poll tax, which many people hated, but which the states used as a mechanism. And a few states actually had taxes on certain kinds of assets or even certain kinds of income. One big method that was very important to certain states for raising money was an import tax. New York, for example, funded half of its entire state budget out of an import tax on imports into New York. And from New York's point of view, the great thing about that was much of the tax was paid by people from Connecticut and New Jersey. So on the one hand, New York kept its taxes low for its farmers, who were very happy about that, because they got people from other states basically to pay for New York's government's operations. So there were a range of taxes. Now, that said, in many of the states, there was a lot of resistance to paying taxes. People were very upset because their taxes went up after the Revolutionary War, both to pay state debts and to pay Confederation debts. So there was tax protest, there was tax resistance. People would get together and agree that if the sheriff came in and tried to sell someone's property, no one would bid at the auction. And the sheriff would go away and say, I couldn't get the money. Or people would rough up the sheriff when he showed up to conduct an auction and say, if you don't want things to get uglier, you need to leave town now. And so some of the states, there's no question about this, had trouble collecting part of the tax revenues that they wanted to collect. But many of the states were able to collect enough money to run their state governments. And we know this because, in fact, some of the states actually reduced their state debt during this period. So we know they were collecting enough money to cover their state debts. And in fact, in some cases, the states even assumed some of the Confederation debt that was owed to their own citizens and paid it. So we know the states were collecting money. They just weren't turning the money over to the Confederation.
I find two things about your descriptions to be very striking. The first is, I have to believe that the inability of the central government to tax people or to encourage the states to fulfill their requisitions must have become problematic to the point where people would have wanted to change things. I mean, I admit that's probably a really presentist point of view, but it's something that I find striking. The other thing I find striking about your description is that if you have New York effectively taxing the citizens of Connecticut and New Jersey to use its ports so that its own citizens don't have to pay taxes, I can't imagine that meetings of Congress would have been very amicable. I mean, given that laws had to pass either unanimously or with a supermajority, I can't see congressmen from Connecticut and New Jersey wanting to work with a congressman of New York on any issue. So this cultural and political dynamic really must have hindered the operations of the Confederation government, too.
Well, I think those are both terrific observations. And as to the second one especially, it got to the point where New Jersey's legislature was so upset about the amount of New York taxes their citizens were paying that they basically called up the Confederation and said, here's the thing, we're never going to send you another check unless you find a way to stop New York from taxing us. We just refuse to pay any more bills to the Confederation under the requisition system unless and until you get New York to stop taxing us. Problem was, the Confederation had no way to make New York stop using an import tax. They had no power to do that at all. And so New York just went happily on its way, funding half of its state budget out of the import tax. And Congress basically sent a delegation to New Jersey, threatened New Jersey with a variety of unpleasant consequences if New Jersey didn't agree to keep sending at least some money, to the Confederation. As to the first part of your question about taxation, people believed that there was a logical progression that would occur if you gave the central government tax power. They believed that if you gave the central government tax power, it would create a standing army using the tax power because it would need it to make sure that the taxes got paid. And once there was a standing army, they would have to feed the soldiers. People would want to have generals. The generals would want to get paid big salaries. And all of a sudden, the standing army would be used to protect wealthy people. And so the argument about the tax power was an argument that involved enormous implications from the point of view of most people who were concerned about central government power. And at the very same time, many of them thought that they might lose. For example, the central tax power might be used to pay debts that the Confederation had run up that they would get no benefit from. A lot of the Confederation debt was held in the northern states. People in the southern states had not bought Confederation debt during the war. So if Confederation taxes were used to pay the Confederation domestic debt, much of the benefit of the taxes would go to the north, not to the south. So when all was said and done, there was very little incentive, either for ideological reasons or for practical political reasons, for many of the states to want the power to be given to the central government. And at the very same time, some of the states were completely apoplectic about the fact that tax powers were being used to hurt their citizens. But believe it or not, Congress debated in one form or another, creating a tax power, giving it to the Confederation over a period of about 6 years. The primary goal was to create a 5% import tax power, supplemented by a certain contribution each year from each state, and it never got done. And meanwhile, the Confederation is going broke because the states aren't paying their bills. And yet people kept thinking, sooner or later, we're going to get the states to agree to this. It's just so rational. There's no question they'll do it. And New York was the final holdout on the import tax issue. And Congress pushed New York for almost 2 years to the legislature to do something about it. But the New York legislature thought having a New York import tax was terrific. So they just refused to agree that the federal government should have an import tax because they would lose their state import tax. And the result was that when the convention began, the Confederation had no more tax power than it had when the Confederation was created and when Congress first asked for the power 6 years earlier.
Thus far, we've been focused on states' conflicting views over the finances of the Confederation government. But the finances of the Confederation was only one of the issues that the states disagreed on. As George mentioned earlier, territorial expansion was another large issue that the states disagreed over. And after we talk about our episode sponsor, we'll have George tell us all about the territorial boundaries of the United States and the issues and disagreements that arose over westward expansion. History and archival work go hand in hand. Letters, journals, and diaries are just some of the key records historians use to better understand the past. In fact, researchers will spend hours examining and transcribing all these different types of records, all to help them see particular moments of the past better. They may also spend lots of time and money traveling to archives to conduct their research too. Although now, research is getting a bit easier and a bit cheaper to do as more and more archives are digitizing their records and putting them up online so that anyone with a computer can examine them. In fact, The Omohundro Institute, the producer of Ben Franklin's World, is a primary partner in one such project to put the entire archive of the Georgian monarchs online. Locked for over a century in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle, the papers of the King Georges, George I, II, III, and IV, as well as of King William IV and all their family members and advisors, are now in the process of being digitized. And historians have only seen a small fraction of what is in these some 350,000 items in this collection. Now, the Georgian Papers program is actually a great opportunity for all fans of history, because soon you can explore these records for yourself, and you can help historians and archivists transcribe these handwritten documents as they continue to come up online. So if you enjoy exploring handwritten historical documents, you should sign up to be among the first in the Omohundro Institute's team of citizen transcribers. To become a citizen transcriber, just visit benfranklinsworld.com/transcribe. George, let's dive into the disputes over Western expansion by talking about boundaries. Would you tell us about the Treaty of Paris 1783 and the territorial boundaries it established for the new United States?
Sure. And you're absolutely right. This, to me, is one of the most fascinating problems of this entire period, and I think is ultimately as important in bringing the states into the Philadelphia Convention probably as the text ever was. The territorial boundaries that were established for the United States by the Treaty of Paris in 1783 looked terrific on paper. It looked as though the United States had been given an enormous new territory by Great Britain. Basically, the boundaries would have moved from the Appalachian Mountains, where they were at the beginning of the war, let's say, to the Mississippi River in the west, north to the Great Lakes, and south to what we think of today as northern Florida. And they included the right to navigate the Mississippi River. So on paper, it looks like there's been a massive expansion of United States territory. Only two small problems. Neither Great Britain nor Spain actually wanted the United States to be able to use any of that territory. And Native Americans lived in much of the new territory, and they didn't want to see anybody live there except Native Americans. And so the story really of the next 3 or 4 years after the war is people are flooding west, and I mean flooding west. No one can believe how many people are leaving New England to move west, are leaving the southern states to move west. And when they get there, chronic low-level warfare breaks out with Native Americans. And at the very same time, both Britain and Spain are trying to find ways to help the Native Americans resist American expansion. And they're really very creative about how they do that. So this is a huge problem because Congress itself is divided over whether it's a good idea for the country to expand west. Some congressmen are very concerned that the eastern states are losing tax revenues every time somebody leaves town because they're not going to pay taxes once they're out on the frontier, even if they're technically part of the same state. People in Kentucky, what was then called the Kentucky District of Virginia, which was basically the far western area of Virginia, they weren't paying taxes to Virginia. So every one of those people who left Norfolk or Richmond was a tax loss to the central government. And a lot of leaders are very concerned about that. Land values were going down in the eastern states. They were depressed already because of the recession. But every time somebody left to go find better land in the west, land prices would drop in the areas where these people were leaving from. And one other big problem that George Washington was especially concerned about, and that is when these people got out on the western frontiers, the Spanish in particular were trying to recruit them to become subjects of the Spanish Empire, break away from the United States and become part of the Spanish Empire. And Washington thought there was a real possibility that that's exactly what Western settlers would do, and he wasn't alone. Rufus King from Massachusetts, General St. Clair from Pennsylvania, they all thought that Western settlement created the distinct possibility that these areas would break away from the United States. And so they were all very concerned about Western settlement. But at the same time, there were members of Congress who wanted to see Western expansion. Most of the southern states thought that the future of their economies was really moving west toward the Mississippi River and using the Mississippi to ship goods down south. So Congress spent several years debating land policy. And unfortunately, Congress was able to create this area in the treaty and then get the states to waive their claims to this area. So it created the national domain, but it couldn't control the national domain. It couldn't control settlement. The settlers settled illegally on lands that Congress said were still supposed to be occupied by Native Americans, and Confederation couldn't do anything about it. Confederation couldn't even survey the lands because the Native Americans said, we're going to kill the surveyors if they don't leave. And the surveyors said, life is short. We think we'd like to leave. So the Confederation couldn't even survey lands to sell them. And in effect, they let the frontier just kind of be on its own for most of this period of time. And this becomes a pretty fundamental problem that the convention has to come to terms with. And it kind of comes to a head in 1786 because the British held all of their forts. They had 9 strategically placed forts in the Northwest. They were supposed to give them up under the terms of the treaty, but they refused. And they refused because the United States itself had violated an important provision of the treaty, which it was clearly true. But when they refused, they were effectively giving the Native American groups both an economic and a military base to operate from. So out there on the frontier, things are pretty much ugly all the time in all the places. And the central government is unable to do much of anything about it during this whole period.
It sounds like for you that these territorial issues and disputes were really the turning point in bringing about the Constitutional Convention of 1787. But I've read other books where historians disagree with you. They say that the real turning point that caused the Constitutional Convention was Shays' Rebellion. Would you tell us about Shays' Rebellion and what role you think it played in convening the Philadelphia Convention?
Well, I devote an entire chapter of my book to Shays' Rebellion because I think Shays' Rebellion is really one of the most interesting things that happens during this entire period of time. This is an armed rebellion in which several thousand people from primarily Western Massachusetts decide that they are so upset with the Massachusetts government that they're going to close down the entire Massachusetts court system. That's going to make it impossible to collect debts. It's going to make it impossible to collect taxes. And their position is, unless and until we get the reforms we want from the Massachusetts government, we're not going to let the courts operate. And it breaks out in the summer of 1786, the late summer of 1786. And it has a lot of popular support. There are probably only a couple of thousand men in the field for the rebels, which some people call them the regulators, some people call them rebels or insurgents. They probably only have a couple of thousand men in the field, but they have plenty of popular support because economic conditions in Massachusetts were miserable. Taxes were high. There was debt all over the place, and a lot of people just hated the court system, which was very expensive and very friendly to creditors. So on the one hand, there's not a ton of people out in the field militarily. On the other hand, they have a lot of people who are saying, those guys really have a point. We really need to do something about these problems. And the Massachusetts government is divided about this to the point where, to begin with, they don't put a force in the field against the rebels for months after the regulation begins. Instead, the legislature sits around and debates what we ought to do. Should we concede some of the demands? The rebels wanted reforms in the court system. They wanted reforms in the actual Constitution of Massachusetts, and they wanted paper money. And the legislature is debating, what should we do about any of this? And basically, to begin with, they ultimately decide, we're going to make some concessions about the way people pay taxes, so on. But it's not enough. It doesn't change the mind of the rebels. And the rebels then begin to step up the pace in terms of the number of courts they're trying to block, and they try to threaten the federal arsenal at Springfield, the military arsenal at Springfield. So at this point, the national government starts to get very concerned about what's going on, and they ultimately authorize some Confederation troops to assist Massachusetts, but they can't pay them because by then they're dead broke. So Massachusetts has to borrow money from its own merchants to fund a Massachusetts military force to take on the rebels. And they do. And ultimately, they have very little trouble beating the rebels using the federal arsenal because the federal arsenal has cannons and the rebels have none. And so from a military point of view, this is pretty easy. But politically, what it shows people is that the Massachusetts government is so divided that they can't enforce the law against a popular rebellion. And people just are having trouble believing that people would take up an armed rebellion against their own government that they just finished electing in popular elections. Nothing like this has ever really happened in the United States. It's one thing to set up a rebellion against the British because they're seen as, a foreign government. But this is people taking on their own elected government. And some people think this is treason. Samuel Adams, for example, believed that this was treason and that these people should be hung for what they did. But they have a lot of popular support, so ultimately many of them get pardoned or get commuted sentences that are short and so on. So the rebellion is very important, and it causes a lot of consternation, a lot of fear in Massachusetts and in New England. Not, as my book shows, in most of the rest of the country. And as a result, it is fair to say that Shays' Rebellion changed a lot of minds in Massachusetts and probably in New England about whether the Confederation should be made stronger because people realized, hey, those guys are going to have a national army to prevent this kind of stuff from happening in states in the future. But other parts of the country, people did not think they were going to have their own little Shays' Rebellion. They didn't think there was a serious threat that would happen. Quite frankly, Massachusetts was running a really very unpopular, very, very conservative government at this point, probably more unpopular and more conservative than almost any government in the country. Its legislature was dominated by wealthy people from eastern Massachusetts. So a lot of people looked at this and went, boy, these people in Massachusetts are really not doing a good job running their government. And I would say Washington, for example, pretty much felt that way about what was going on up there. So in other parts of the country, there were other things that pushed people toward the Philadelphia Convention, where they also really had not wanted to go, but not Shays' Rebellion. So its importance is regional at best, and its importance is overstated because other factors drove other parts of the country to the table. And in fact, this territorial issue probably was way more fundamental for most of the South in terms of getting them to the table.
To this point, we've talked about severe economic problems, territorial disputes and problems, and armed domestic rebellion. And in all of these cases, it sounds like the Confederation government was unable to resolve any of these issues. I mean, it honestly sounds like Congress was involved in a stalemate. So now we have to wonder what changed. George, what was the turning point or the point of no return that brought Americans to the table at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 and to the decision that they couldn't just alter the Confederation government, but actually needed to create a stronger national government instead?
Those are great questions. And let me just emphasize to you that stalemate is a great description of what was going on during this period. Because, in fact, the Confederation government was stalemated, both on tax powers and on Confederation debt policy and on proposals to give the central government commerce powers and on Western policy. And on Western policy, the critical issue is what's called the Spanish Treaty, which was this really clever plot by Spain to close the Mississippi River, which it did in 1784 to Americans, and then turn around and tell the United States, we would be happy to make a trade treaty with you if you will agree to keep the Mississippi River closed. And did we mention that the trade treaty will let New England sell us a lot of fish, but that we don't want Southern tobacco included in the trade treaty? So, of course, New England loved the idea of keeping the river closed and entering into the Spanish Treaty. The South was apoplectic at the idea that the river would remain closed because it would kill Western settlement. There was no point in being a farmer in Western Tennessee if you couldn't ship your products down the Mississippi River for export. There's just no reason to do it. So the Spanish Treaty deadlocked Congress. It was debated in the summer of 1786, and during the debate, both sides say, if we don't get what we want, we're seriously going to consider just leaving the Union. Okay, so the Confederation government is stalemated. So what causes people to think we have no choice but to come to the table and consider making a bunch of different changes as opposed to tinkering with the Confederation government? Well, what happens in the southern states is that at the very same time that the Spanish Treaty is deadlocking Congress, very significant Native American warfare is breaking out around the South and West. And the people out there quickly realize that neither their own states nor the Confederation can do anything about it. And they realize that instead of having 700 troops in the entire Confederation Army, which is all the Confederation had at this point, because people were so opposed to having a standing army, we need an army that can take on the Native Americans and protect Western settlement. So they all of a sudden move from thinking, maybe we'll break away, maybe we'll go become allies of Spain or subjects of Spain, to thinking, no, we need a more powerful central government. And so all of a sudden, the West becomes allies with George Washington and the nationalists, many of whom are, the coastal cities and merchants that want to see a powerful government so that it could have real commerce power and so on. So that moves the southern states toward the table. And at the very same time, of course, 1787 is the point at which the Confederation has to start paying back its foreign debt. And it has no way whatsoever to start paying back its foreign debt in any fundamental way. And a lot of that debt is owed to France, which was our major ally during the war. And here we are saying to the French, thanks for lending us what amounts to millions of dollars. We can't pay you at a time when France actually increasingly really needs the money. So the government is financially collapsing. Congress is completely stalemated. And the states are now really nervous about social unrest in the North, in the case of Shays' Rebellion and things like it, and the fact that Native American warfare is breaking out along the frontier. And pretty much everybody realizes we're all going to have to come to the table. And this time we're going to have to come to the table without imposing limits. We can't come to the table and say, we want a tax power, but nothing else. Or we want a commerce power, but nothing else. We have to come to the table and say, okay, this is what we want, and we're willing to consider what you want in return. That creates the stage for a grand bargain. And the Constitution is an intersectional, elite grand bargain. That's the core of the Constitution. That's what it does. And the way the Constitution does that is that it essentially destroys the Confederation voting system by abandoning the rule that all states are equal in Congress, abandoning the principle of supermajority voting for core powers, abandoning the principle that changes can only be unanimous. And all of this, I might say, including the need to create a grand bargain, you can really give credit to George Washington for, because Washington from the very beginning saw that you needed a majority voting system, that you needed to be open to the possibility of creating a grand bargain, or you weren't going to be able to create a government that could avoid stalemate. And that was his primary goal, was having a government that could actually enforce the law. Because at the end of the day, Washington's biggest criticism of the Confederation was not, it doesn't have this power, it doesn't have that power. His biggest criticism was, this is a government that can't enforce any law that it has the power to make. It can't make states pay requisitions. It can't make settlers stay off of Native American land. It can't enforce treaties. I mean, the government would make a treaty, 1783 Treaty of Peace, and 4 major states violated the key provision in the treaty that the British put in to protect their own citizens, and the Confederation couldn't do anything about it. And so Washington actually writes to John Jay in 1786, and he says, you tell the states that they have violated the treaty, they will laugh in your face. He's that contemptuous of the whole process. So everything's collapsing pretty much at the same time, and there are at least enough people who are afraid of the possibility of collapse that they come to the table, and they come to the table with no preconditions about what kind of a new bargain they're going to make.
Now, before we jump into the time warp, at the end of We Have Not a Government, George notes that when he described his research project to people, those people often compare the political stalemate of the Confederation period with what they see as a political stalemate in today's United States Congress. And coincidentally, when I asked if anyone had questions for George in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook, Ed and Fraser mentioned the same stalemate that others told George about. In fact, Fraser noted that he sees one in British Parliament. So, George, Ed and Fraser would like to know whether the framers of the Articles of Confederation knew that this Constitution would cause such a stalemate when they drafted and ratified this government. And they'd really like to know how early Americans ended their congressional stalemate and whether there are any lessons in how they ended that stalemate that we might find helpful today as we try to end deadlocks and impasses in Congress and Parliament?
Those are all great questions. And I have to say that nothing about my book surprised me more than the conversations I had with people who I would tell them what the book was about, and they would say to me, "Oh, that sounds just like the United States today." Because as I said earlier in the show, I started working on this book because of an argument in 1783 between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. It was not because I saw parallels between the United States today and this period. But I've gotten that response from people over and over and over when I've told them about the book. And I'm convinced as a result that they're right about that today's stalemate actually does resemble the 1780 stalemate in some important ways. And I'll come back to that. But to answer the first question, did the drafters of the Articles know that it would cause a stalemate? No, they absolutely did not know that. And they thought they were creating an effective government, but they based it on some principles that it turns out experience showed were unworkable. They believed in a very pure theory of republicanism. For them, the United States was a collection of 13 republics, and the Confederation government was simply supposed to be a collective agent of those 13 republics. So its limited powers were actually an expression of Republican philosophy. It didn't need to have more powers because the states could be counted on to come together in Congress, have a rational debate about issues, make a decision that reflected the views both of the majority and of part of the minority. That's what the supermajority principle is about. And that the states would then follow the decisions Congress made. Samuel Adams called the decisions made by Congress a cement of the Union. So he really believed that when Congress made a decision, the states would line up and carry it out. It just didn't turn out that way. It didn't turn out that way at all, both because the states' conflicting political and economic interests meant that it was hard for them to have a disinterested debate to resolve various issues. And as a result, that supermajorities for any good policy were very difficult to get. And because the Confederation government had no power to enforce decisions if the states disobeyed them. So most of the underlying assumptions of the creation of the Articles of Confederation turned out to be false, but that was the result of experience, not the result of anticipation on their part that things would work out this way. They thought that they were creating not only an effective government, but a government that was the purest expression of the principles of the revolution. And people really believed that. They believed this was the best way to protect freedom, was to have the smallest possible, weakest possible central government. And unfortunately, this period shows that, at least in this period, that did not work. Now, as to the connection between that stalemate and today's stalemate, historical analogies are never perfect, but today we also have problems that are a result of the fact that our government does not make decisions on the basis of national majority will. There are a bunch of different examples that I could give, but the one that I give in the book, which is, I think, pretty important, is this. When the Senate of the United States was established, there was a huge debate at the Constitutional Convention about the establishment of the Senate. And some people wanted the Senate to reflect either population or wealth of the various states, so that, for example, Pennsylvania would have more votes in the Senate than, say, Delaware. It didn't work out that way. As a compromise, the House of Representatives was organized on population basis, but the Senate is based on equal voting by state. Now, that was a compromise, not an agreement that that was a good principle. And at the time that that compromise was agreed to, Virginia was 12 times as large as Delaware, Virginia being the biggest state, Delaware being the smallest state. Today, the largest state, California, has 65 times the population of Wyoming. And yet, 230 years after we started, we still give Delaware the same vote in the United States Senate as California. I suggest to you that the people who wrote the Constitution would be very concerned about the fact that no adjustment has been made, because what it means is that, in fact, very often decisions are not being made on the basis of majority will. They're being made on the basis of a set of what are now essentially arbitrary rules that were created 230 years ago. So the Constitution itself contained compromises like that and several others that contribute to today's stalemate. The Constitution, as I said, I think a little earlier, was intended to avoid stalemate by making political power correlate directly with population or wealth, which were essentially synonymous at that time. Political power and population or wealth were supposed to be directly related to each other, and the majority will principle was supposed to be used wherever possible to make national policy decisions. We, I think, as a country, have moved a long way from that set of ideas, which were pretty fundamental to curing the stalemate problems of the 1780s.
Now it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
While reading We Have Not a Government, one aspect that really fascinated me was just how many times various congressmen and states discussed leaving the Union over disagreements. Now, none of the states actually left the Union in the 1780s. But George, what would have happened if the states had followed up on their threats and the Confederation had been broken up into sectional or regional confederacies? How many different confederacies do you think would have formed? And what do you think United States history would be like today if all those confederacies had come into being?
This is a very interesting question. I will say as a professional historian that I think that this answer has to be purely speculative answer because history does not reveal its alternatives. So it didn't happen that way, and there is no way to know what would have happened if things had turned out differently. So that's my professional historian's disclaimer. I will say that the scenario you just described was George Washington's worst fear about what could happen to the United States, because Washington believed that if the United States broke up into separate confederacies, which he thought was a real possibility at the time, that one of two things would happen. Either a civil war would break out between the different confederacies as they struggled to control the national territory, or foreign governments would take advantage of the fact that the smaller confederacies would inevitably be weaker to invade and occupy different parts of the North American continent. And I would suggest to you that no one can know this for sure because it didn't happen that way, but that Washington's fears were probably very realistic. Because if the Confederation had broken up at the time, most people believed that either two separate confederations would be formed, one consisting of the 8 northern and mid-Atlantic states and one consisting of the 5 southern states, or there would be 3 separate confederations, a New England Confederation, a Mid-Atlantic Confederation, and a Southern Confederation. Now, by themselves, no one of those confederations would probably have been powerful enough to withstand a British invasion. And recall that the British still held all the western forts. They still occupied Canada, and they were not happy about the fact that they had to give up the Northwest, which was a very rich territory for fur trading and other products. So Washington was afraid that the country would break up into pieces, and I think he was dead right to be concerned about what would happen. You can see the possibility of civil war breaking out from the fact that James Monroe wrote letters about the possibility of a breakup in 1786, which he actually thought was being plotted by some of the northern and mid-Atlantic states, and said that if a breakup occurred, it was going to be necessary to use force against Pennsylvania to make sure that it joined a Southern Confederacy. And if that isn't a recipe for a civil war, I don't really know what is. So to kind of quickly take this chain of speculation, if things had broken up, either 2 or 3 confederacies, and either a civil war or an invasion, and Washington thought that if there was a civil war, the likely result was a military dictatorship, a new monarchy that would be created in the United States. So the reason that Washington wanted to strengthen the Confederation was precisely to avoid that kind of breakup. And from the book, you can see that by 1786, a lot of people were thinking seriously about the possibility that the country would break up.
George, now that you have an answer to your question about Hamilton and Madison's different viewpoints, What are you researching now?
Well, I will describe this as kind of a tentative thing because my first two books, my book about slavery and my book about the formation of the Constitution, actually one sort of flowed from the other. That is, I realized things in writing the slavery book that led me to start working on the Confederation period. Right now, I'm doing background research on what will seem like a very different topic, and that is the United States response to the rise of Adolf Hitler and his rearmament of Germany and his move toward taking over Europe in the 1930s. That's the subject that I'm currently doing research about, and I'm still trying to decide both whether I want to pursue that topic and if so, what the shape of the book is going to be. But in effect, We Have Not a Government sort of took me in that general direction.
How can we contact you with questions about the Articles of Confederation or the Confederation period?
I think the easiest way to get more information about me is to look at my profile on the Seattle University School of Law website. My email address is on the website, and that's the best way to reach me.
George Van Cleve, thank you for helping us better understand the Articles of Confederation and the issues that face the Confederation government.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you. I personally think this is a fascinating subject, but I suppose most authors say that about the things they write about. But I want to tell you, I encourage people to read the book because it's going to resonate with a lot of things that are going on today.
The Articles of Confederation was the first Constitution of the United States. It was drafted in 1777 and adopted by all 13 states in 1781. Now, the Articles offered a very different type of government than the one offered by the Constitution of 1787. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Union of the 13 states was loose. It provided for a one-house government where all the states had an equal vote, and there was no separate executive or judicial branch. In fact, in order to pass any law, 9 of the 13 states had to agree to that law, and if you wanted to pass an amendment, well, you needed all 13 states to agree to that amendment. Now, the framers of the Articles of Confederation truly believed that the Articles offered the United States a government founded on the purest principles of the American Revolution. It was a government that carefully guarded against the development of a strong central government, which could heavily tax its people and use a standing army to enforce its taxation policies. Just as they believed the government of Great Britain had just done to them. Of course, this type of loose confederation meant that individual state governments held most of the power. It means that state governments were actually stronger than the national government. And unfortunately, none of the state governments proved strong and capable enough to handle all of the problems that faced the new nation. And there were a lot of problems. After the War for Independence, Americans experienced a severe economic depression, quick and fast expansion into new territories far removed from government power and direction, poor and martial relations with Native American peoples, foreign meddling, an inability to enforce its treaties and pay debts, and domestic insurrection. All of these were problems that struck the United States right after it achieved its independence from Great Britain, and few of the states could agree on how to solve any of these problems. Of course, as George revealed, it didn't really help the situation that regional rivalries seemed to be running amok during this period, too. I mean, what was the incentive for the people of New Jersey and Connecticut to work with the people of New York to try to solve these problems when New York actively went out of its way to tax their citizens? Now, although these problems plagued the Confederacy between 1781 and 1787, it was only in 1787 that the states finally came to the bargaining table to try and seriously solve and address the problems plaguing their young nation. So, what was it about 1787 that finally brought the states to the bargaining table? George believes it was fear that the United States and its government would collapse amidst all the chaos. It was the fear of even more chaos that brought the 13 states to the bargaining table. And at that bargaining table, the states crafted a compromise solution, the Constitution of 1787, which George sees as an intersectional elite grand bargain. Now, the Constitution offered the United States an entirely new type of government, all built on the experiences the states had gleaned during the Confederation period. This meant that the new government had strong central powers, that the framers thought stood a chance at ending the stalemate between the states and a chance at addressing all the large economic, territorial, political, and diplomatic problems that faced their young nation. Look for more information about George, his book, We Have Not a Government, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/179. The Omohundro Institute is looking for transcribers. Help the OI and the Royal Archivists transcribe the papers of the King Georges and the members of their household. Visit benfranklinsworld.com/transcribe to sign up. Finally, I don't know about you, but I still have questions about the Confederation period. Specifically, I want to know why and how the 13 states created and ratified the Articles of Confederation. I'm actually slowly conducting research on this topic with the hope that maybe someday it'll turn into a book. Now, if you still have questions about the Confederation period too, I'd love to hear them because this is a period that really fascinates me. So please send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.